3 atomic bombs fell on the hills around Dien Bien Phu on 20th of April 1954, and the West used nuclear weapons against an Asian army for the second time in 9 years. The valley had been chosen deliberately. On 20th November 1953, French paratroopers dropped into the basin in Operation Castor, seizing an old airstrip in a bowl of paddy and scrub ringed by wooded hills. The French did not occupy and did not intend to. General Henri Navarre wanted a battle. He wanted Vo Nguyen Giap to come down out of the highlands and mass his divisions against a fortified camp where French artillery and French air power would destroy them in the open, and he built the camp on the theory that Giap could not bring guns to the crest of those hills. Colonel Christian de Castries held the valley with roughly 10,800 men. They were foreign legionnaires, Algerian and Moroccan tirailleurs, Thai auxiliaries recruited from the surrounding hills, and Vietnamese paratroopers, a French army that was, in its majority, not French. Through the winter, tens of thousands of Vietnamese porters carried Chinese-supplied 105mm howitzers up the reverse slopes by hand and by bicycle, disassembled and hauled piece by piece, and dug them into casemates that faced the valley floor. Colonel Charles Perroth, the garrison's one-armed artillery commander, had promised his counter-battery fire would silence anything Giap could put on those ridges. On 13 March 1954, the general assault opened against the strongpoint Beatrice, and Perroth understood within 48 hours that he had been wrong about everything. On 15 March, he pulled the pin from a grenade in his dugout and held it against his chest. What happened next in the real world was a surrender. What happened in this telling is something else. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The argument was never really about Dien Bien Phu. On 29th of March 1954, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles called publicly for united action in Indochina, and Admiral Arthur Radford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, arrived with a plan already drawn: massed carrier and land-based air attack against the Viet Minh siege works, delivered fast enough to break the encirclement before the garrison's perimeter collapsed. General Matthew Ridgway, Army Chief of Staff, opposed it. Ridgway had commanded in Korea. He understood what Radford would not say aloud: that air power delivered in a jungle war does not stay in the air, that broken sieges must be exploited by somebody's infantry, and that the somebody would be American. On 30 April, Dulles and Radford met congressional leaders in a closed room. Senate Minority Leader Lyndon Johnson and Senator Richard Russell listened and then set their price. Allies must participate, and France must promise real independence to the Associated States. On 7th April, Eisenhower stood at a press conference and described a row of dominoes. Everyone remembers the metaphor. Fewer remember that the same man had spent the spring refusing to act alone. Anthony Eden refused. The Churchill government would not join any strike before the Geneva Conference had been given its chance, and in our history, that refusal ended the operation. It is worth sitting with that. Not fate, not doctrine, a decision made by a man in a room who could have decided otherwise. Here, he still refuses, but Congress does not. The resolution passes. The Allied condition is quietly reinterpreted as the participation of the Associated States themselves, and Eisenhower has his cover. What he authorizes is not Radford's original plan. Aircraft from the USS Essex, operating with Task Force 70 in the Gulf of Tonkin, delivered 3 Mark 7 weapons on 20 April. The Mark 7 was a tactical fission bomb of variable yield, somewhere between 8 and 60 kilotons, small enough for a Navy attack aircraft to carry. 2 went against the artillery belt on the eastern ridges. The third fell across the supply corridor where the porter columns converged, 12 kilometers from the perimeter wire. The hills burned for a day and a half. Between 6,000 and 12,000 Viet Minh soldiers and porters died within the hour, and the number has never been fixed because a substantial fraction of the dead were not soldiers and were never on any roll. The 351st Heavy Division ceased to exist as a formation, not destroyed to a man, but stripped of its guns, its ammunition dumps, its engineers, and the human logistics chain that had made the guns possible in the first place. The siege did not so much break as evaporate. Inside the wire, de Castries' men watched the ridgeline they had been dying against for 5 weeks turn white, and then black. There was no cheering. Several accounts describe silence lasting into the evening. 11,000 men had been saved, and every one of them understood, in a way the men who ordered it could not, what had been spent to save them. Geneva convened on 26th of April, 6 days after the strike, and the Indochina phase opened on 8th of May at a table where nothing could be traded. In the real timeline, the garrison fell on 7 May, and the conference met the following morning with the answer already written. The Accords of 21 July partitioned Vietnam at the 17th parallel, pending elections that were never held. Here, there is no 17th parallel. There is no parallel at all. France had no need of terms. The Viet Minh delegation, arriving from a battlefield where their heavy division had been annihilated by a weapon they could not answer, had no capacity to enforce them. Molotov's Soviet delegation had come to divide a country and found the premise of the conference destroyed before the first session. Zhou Enlai said little. What emerged after 11 weeks was a ceasefire line drawn around what the French Union actually held, a northern Vietnam under French administration, an insurgency that never surrendered, and a document nobody in the room believed. The garrison had been rescued. The war had not been ended, and the photographs were already moving. The wire services had the images by the first week of May. The scorched ridges, the shape of the valley, the burn casualties in the field hospitals at Hanoi. The arithmetic assembled itself in every capital outside the North Atlantic. 9 years, 2 weapons, 2 Asian armies. Nobody had to say it. Jawaharlal Nehru said it anyway. India, Sukarno's Indonesia, and the Arab states had come to Colombo and to Bandung with non-alignment as a posture, a preference, a way of extracting concessions from both blocs. It left as a bloc. What crystallized in 1954 and 1955 was not a mood but an institution, and its founding grievance was specific and racial and difficult to argue with. In Britain, Eden had refused participation and now faced the consequences of a strike he had neither authorized nor prevented. Labour split the Commons. The government survived on the argument that condemning Washington would achieve nothing and cost everything. In Paris, Pierre Mendès France came to power in June, promising to finish the war by other means, and discovered that a war which cannot be lost militarily can still be lost year by year. France now held a Vietnam. It could not administer, could not enfranchise, and could not leave. But the decision that would outlast all of it was being made 3,000 kilometers north, in a room in Beijing. Chinese advisors under Wei Guoqing had built Giap's siege. They had supplied the ammunition, the engineering doctrine, the Katyusha launchers that arrived in the final weeks. Some of them died on those ridges on 20 of April, and Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and Peng Dehuai understood the weapon that killed them as a message with a Chinese address. The reading was not paranoid. Radford had spoken of the Chinese hand in Indochina for a year. The Korean armistice was 9 months old. A tactical nuclear weapon had just been used against a field army operating under Chinese direction on China's southern frontier, without a shot fired in reply, because no reply was possible. The Soviet Union had tested a boosted device in August 1953 and possessed no reliable means of striking the continental United States. The nuclear umbrella that Moscow extended over its allies was, in April 1954, a rhetorical object. In actual history, the Chinese leadership took its formal decision to build a bomb in January 1955, and the first device was tested at Lop Nur on 16 October 1964, a decade and a half of scraping and starvation and Soviet withdrawal in between. Here the decision comes in the summer of 1954, and it comes as an absolute priority. Grain, cadres, foreign exchange, the trained physicists, the Soviet cooperation that would be extracted while it could still be extracted. Everything is subordinated. The program runs roughly a decade ahead of its real counterpart, and the world it enters is not the world of 1964. Here is what actually changed on 20th April 1954, and it was not the fate of 11,000 men. Before that day, the atomic bomb was a weapon of last extremity, used twice against cities to end a total war, and every argument for using it again ran uphill against Hiroshima. After that day, it was a weapon that had been used against soldiers in a field, in a limited war, in a colonial theater, with a result that was tactically decisive and strategically survivable. The sky did not fall. Moscow did not respond. And every planning staff in every capital wrote that down. The Quemoy and Matsu crisis is argued in the shadow of it. Suez is planned by men who have seen a precedent. Lebanon, in 1958, is a question of scale rather than kind. Each staff paper now opens with a demonstrated case, and each adversary reading the same case draws the conclusion that safety consists of possession. Britain accelerates. France, humiliated and dependent, accelerates harder. The Chinese program, born in the hills above Dien Bien Phu, produces a device in the mid-1950s, and India, whose founding foreign policy conviction is now that this weapon is used on Asians, has to answer a nuclear neighbor 20 years before it did. The threshold was never a treaty. It was a habit of restraint, and it was maintained by the fact that nobody had done it a second time. De Castries' 11,000 men lived. That is not nothing, and any account that treats it as nothing is dishonest. They went home, most of them, to Algeria and Morocco and Marseille and Hanoi, and they had children, and the men who ordered Vulture could stand in front of those families and say what they had bought. The valley of Dien Bien Phu is an exclusion zone. The Thai villages in the surrounding hills were not evacuated because there was no one to evacuate them and no time in which to do it, and the survivors were resettled in the lowlands, where they remain a minority among strangers. Nobody farms the basin. The rice terraces are still visible from the air. France held a Vietnam it could not hold. The insurgency that the bomb did not kill absorbed a French army for another decade, and every year the argument that a nuclear weapon had already been used there made the next escalation easier to contemplate and harder to justify. The United States owned the precedent it had set, permanently, in the way that a nation owns the things it does first. And the second nuclear age, the age of many participants, of tactical doctrine, of weapons designed to be used rather than to prevent use, began 10 years early, with one more state at the table, and with a founding memory shared by 2/3 of the world's population. Eden's refusal, in the world we actually inhabit, was a decision made by a man in a room who thought a conference deserved a chance. He did not know he was holding a line. He may not have known there was a line. It held anyway, and the 11,000 died or went into captivity, and the 17th parallel was drawn, and Vietnam waited 21 years for a war it would have to fight without an atomic bomb ever falling on it. Whether that was the better world is not a question this account can answer. It is only the one that happened.